is Elizabeth Auchincloss. Welcome to the last and 10th episode of the Psychoanalytic Model of the Mind. In this episode, we will talk about how to use the psychoanalytic model of the mind in order to help our patients. This course has briefly traced the evolution of models of the mind, starting with the work of Freud and going on to explore the work of other people. When we look at the chart in table number 10, the first thing we see is that there are 4 models of the mind charted on axis B and over 100 items or concepts on the rest of the chart. In other words, the sheer contents of the psychoanalytic model of the mind threatens to overwhelm us and to make the concepts hard to use. However, the chart is organized so as to help us see that these 4 models can be used together even while remaining distinct. If we look on axis A, we see there are 5 parameters or dimensions of mental functioning about which each model has much to say. Let us begin by recognizing that these dimensions are the same for each of the 4 models of the mind. In other words, our models don't have totally different things to say about the mind, but only different things to say about each aspect. For example, in the structural model of the mind, among the most important motivations are those related to the body's quest for pleasure. In object relations theory, among the most important motivations are those related to needs for attachment and/or separation. These motivations are different from each other, but they are motivations nonetheless. Therefore, they are charted on the same dimension, motivation. The same thing holds true for the other dimensions: topography, structure and process, development, and psychopathology and treatment. Let us continue to look at the dimensions separately. Topography. Looking at the psychoanalytic model of the mind along the dimension of topography is relatively simple. Almost every component of the mind has a conscious and unconscious component, with very few exceptions. One of these exceptions is the concept of the id, which is rarely used in contemporary psychodynamic work. In other words, clinicians working from a unified psychoanalytic point of view must remember that there is always more to the story than what the patient is aware of, and that patients do not want to know much of what is hidden. Indeed, the most important feature of a unified psychoanalytic model of the mind is the concept of the dynamic unconscious. Motivation. We have just been reminded that concerns about which contents of the mind should be allowed access to consciousness cannot neatly be separated from motivational concerns. Indeed, the dynamic unconscious is defined as the aspect of the mind that we avoid through, quote, the motive of defense, end quote. Clinicians working with any psychoanalytic model of the mind must remember that part of every patient wants to hide awareness of aspects of himself, whatever else he may wish or fear. In fact, as a clinician listens to the patient's story, he will always ask what the patient does not want to know at any given moment. In addition, the psychodynamic clinician will work from a very strong motivational point of view with regard to many other phenomena, examining every behavior and experience with the aim of understanding what motivations this behavior or experience serves. The pleasure principle and the reality principle are always intact, and conflict, signal affect, defense, and compromise are assumed to be part of every picture. In addition, every psychoanalytic model of the mind pays attention to many different motivations, including the search for bodily pleasure, aggressive impulses, wishes for attachment to other people and for separation from them, and wishes for self-actualization, along with the threats to all 4, no matter what view predominates in either therapist or patient. Structure and/or process. Every psychoanalytic model has a structural view of the mind. In other words, a psychodynamic clinician always sees the patient's mind as organized in a stable way over time. The mind does not just consist of fleeting motivations, many of them outside of awareness, but also includes consistent configurations or patterns, along with the processes by which these configurations are modulated. In every psychoanalytic model of the mind, structures and processes are understood to be concerned with self-regulation, adaptation, and defense. Psychodynamic clinicians also look at the importance of narrative structure or of stories in the organization of the mind. Finally, psychodynamic clinicians always look at the structure of the whole person or his character. Development. Every psychoanalytic model of the mind has a developmental point of view, knowing that no part of the mind can be understood apart from its history. This history will always include the story of childhood and include caretakers and family members as well as sentinel events, both happy and sad. In other words, a clinician working with a psychoanalytic model always understands that the mind of the child lives on in the adult. Psychopathology and treatment. Finally, every psychoanalytic model of the mind examines each patient with each of the above points of view with an eye to understanding his or her psychopathology. While this is not a course about psychopathology and/or psychodynamic treatment, psychodynamic clinicians working with different models of the mind have much in common. Psychodynamic treatment strategies may differ, but they share a commitment to understanding the patient's story told to the therapist with as much candor as possible. Exploration of how the story is told will always be part of the therapeutic work. Also, exploration of the transference experience is always part of the process. Every treatment seeks to understand each patient's way of finding pleasure, managing aggression, negotiating attachments and separation, and expressing the self. Every treatment seeks to understand the feelings and fears associated with all of these and the compromises forged among competing aims. This understanding will be shared with the patient so that he can find better ways of handling the challenges of being human. While models of the mind have much in common, they have many differences. A major aim of this course has been to make you aware of differences among our models. Which model is best? It is not clear. This is true partly because we lack methods good enough to answer the question empirically. It is also true because the mind is an immensely complex system. Therefore, it should not be surprising that there are many ways to think about the mind and many ways to intervene with a patient. In other words, if we know that there is a dynamic interaction between many aspects of the mind, we should expect the whole system to change in response to many different kinds of interventions. For example, a stronger self might make a brash young man less annoying to others who resent his constant demands for attention. At the same time, a stronger self might make this same young man less likely to give in to his sadistic superego, which feels to him like a source of power. However, having a less sadistic superego might allow this man to be less passive-aggressive because he might have less need to be defiantly rebellious against all authority. Less rebellion against authority might make this same man allow himself more kinds of pleasure, and therefore be less resentful of those having fun, with less need to upstage them. Less rebellion might also make him more admiring of his father, and therefore more comfortable being idealistic himself. If this man experiences more real idealism instead of only needs for attention, he might like himself better, and so on. Sometimes it is best to conceptualize this young man as dealing with forbidden edible strivings by making himself into an annoying boy. At other times, it will be best to imagine him as needing to stay close to those he loves, even while struggling with aggression towards them. At other times, it will be best to imagine him struggling with a self that feels weak and unrecognized, turning to aggression to feel stronger. We can imagine many interventions at many points. In another example, with regard to the timid young man who dropped his iPhone in a rush to be helpful, should we help him be more aware of his aggressive feelings towards a therapist? Or should we talk about his feelings that he needs to be compliant in order to be loved by others? His obsequious need for love only makes him hate himself more. Perhaps we should talk about this feeling of self-hatred. Or perhaps we should talk about his related feelings of weakness, and his warded-off wishes to be seen as smart and accomplished, which were never recognized by his busy, unhappy parents. Again, the best answer is that we should talk about all of these issues. In this course, we have seen how models of the mind are invented to correct shortcomings of other models. However, each new model also creates new problems and shortcomings. In fact, a clinician who uses only one model of the mind risks overlooking aspects that the patient is struggling with. For this reason, it is wise to use all 4 models of the mind, each of which emphasizes a different aspect of the mind and each of which has different strengths. Choosing the most important issues to talk about at the right time requires experience. Patients differ on which model of the mind best suits the problem with which they are struggling. Patients also differ with respect to which model of the mind best describes their problems at any given moment. However, without our 4 models of the mind in mind, we would not even be alert to the presence of these many issues. Having all models in one's psychodynamic toolbox allows one to best listen to each patient, making sense of his suffering and finding ways to help. In other words, the best way to help our patients is to borrow from all 4 models of the mind. Every patient needs to feel more comfortable with his or her bodily strivings, with his or her wishes for affiliation and separation, and with his or her wishes for self-expression and meaningfulness. Every patient needs to deal with fears associated with all of these. Finally, each patient must deal with the constraints of reality, which include conflict, limitation, and loss. Which of these issues predominates at any given time will vary. However, we need all 4 models of the mind to listen for each of them. In addition, throughout this course, we have tried to emphasize the links between the neighboring disciplines of neuroscience and general psychology and the psychoanalytic model of the mind. We should all be partners in our quest to help our patients. There have been many good efforts to build this partnership. Finally, throughout this course, we have tried to emphasize the fact that psychoanalytic model making should be an ongoing process. For example, listeners must understand that the word superego is simply the name that Freud gave to his observation that most people are strongly influenced by thoughts about right and wrong. Object relations gained traction when clinicians realized that it is difficult to talk about how some people function without thinking about how they organize their experience of self, other, and interaction. Self-psychology would not have survived if thinking in greater detail about the components of the self were not useful. Clinicians always face the same challenges that challenged Freud and his followers. How can we understand patients and how can we help them change? Our models of the mind are important and useful to the extent that they help us to answer these questions. This ends our course on the psychoanalytic model of the mind. We hope that you have enjoyed this course and that, more important, you have learned a lot. Thank you very much, and goodbye for now. For a review of what we have talked about, please see the tables that are marked number 10.